Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Charleston history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they arrive. In 1847, Charleston's humid summer air carried more than the usual scent of magnolia and salt marsh. Within the grand estates of South Battery, where antebellum mansions faced the harbor with their imposing columns and wraparound piazzas, a silence had settled over the Whitmore plantation that would echo through generations. The absence was not immediately noticed. Enslaved people disappeared from plantations with disturbing regularity in those days, their fates rarely documented, their stories seldom told. But Mary Johnson's disappearance was different. It left behind questions that would haunt the Low Country for decades. The Whitmore estate occupied 12 acres along the Ashley River, its main house a testament to old Charleston wealth built on rice and indigo fortunes. Cornelius Whitmore, a man of 53 with graying temples and calculating eyes, had inherited the property from his father, along with 47 enslaved souls. His wife, Evangeline Whitmore, 38 years old with delicate features that masked an iron will, managed the domestic affairs with precision that bordered on obsession. Their son, Edmund, had recently returned from his studies at the College of Charleston, bringing with him modern ideas that often clashed with his father's traditional methods. Mary Johnson had arrived at the Whitmore plantation in 1845, purchased at the Charleston slave market along with her infant daughter, Ruth. Church records from St. Philip's Episcopal, discovered during renovations in 1962, contain marginal notes that suggest Mary was literate, an unusual and dangerous trait for an enslaved woman. The notation, written in faded brown ink, reads simply, "Peculiar education. Monitor closely." What made Mary's case extraordinary was not just her disappearance, but what she left behind, a collection of writings that would surface decades later, revealing a perspective on plantation life that defied every acceptable narrative of the era. The summer of 1847 began like any other on the Whitmore estate. The rice fields stretched toward the horizon, tended by enslaved laborers who rose before dawn and worked until sunset. The slave quarters, located a quarter-mile from the main house, consisted of 23 cabins, arranged in 2 parallel rows. Mary and Ruth occupied the cabin closest to the overseer's house, a position that, according to later testimony, allowed for constant surveillance. The arrangement was not coincidental. Edmund Whitmore, in a letter to his cousin dated July 15, 1847, described the plantation as a model of Southern efficiency, noting that "father has achieved remarkable order among the Negroes." The letter, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives until 1968, when it mysteriously disappeared, painted a picture of domestic tranquility that would prove to be carefully constructed fiction. The first indication that something was amiss came from Celia Washington, an elderly enslaved woman who served as the unofficial midwife and healer for the plantation community. According to oral histories collected by Works Progress Administration researchers in 1936, Celia approached the overseer, James Sullivan, in mid-July with concerns about Mary's behavior. She reported that Mary had been talking to herself in the evenings and scratching marks on wood with pieces of charcoal. Sullivan, a harsh man from County Cork who had arrived in Charleston 5 years earlier, initially dismissed these concerns as the superstitious fears of an old woman. The plantation operated on a strict schedule that left little room for individual expression. Enslaved workers rose at 4:30 each morning to the sound of a brass bell, worked in the fields until midday, rested during the hottest hours, then returned to labor until sunset. Evening meals were communal, eaten in the space between the cabin rows under the watchful eye of Sullivan or his assistant, Thomas Reed. Conversations were discouraged, reading was forbidden, and any gathering of more than 3 enslaved people required supervision. Mary Johnson's daily routine deviated from this pattern in subtle ways that in retrospect revealed a carefully planned strategy. Kitchen records from the plantation, preserved in the Charleston Museum's manuscript collection, show that Mary frequently requested extra tallow candles, claiming they were needed for Ruth's nighttime care. The child, then 2 years old, was described by witnesses as unusually quiet and observant, traits that may have been cultivated rather than natural. The Whitmore family maintained detailed records of plantation operations, including inventories of tools, livestock, and human property. These documents, discovered in a sealed trunk during the demolition of the mansion in 1955, revealed patterns that painted a disturbing picture of life on the estate. Medical expenses for enslaved workers were unusually high, with frequent entries for nervous disorders and melancholy. More troubling were the recurring purchases of restraints and medications described only as sedatives for difficult cases. Dr. Thaddeus Morrison, the plantation's physician, kept separate notes on his visits to the Whitmore estate. His journal, donated to the Medical University of South Carolina by his great-grandson in 1961, contains observations that he clearly intended to keep private. An entry dated June 23, 1847 reads, "Young woman Mary continues to exhibit signs of intellectual capacity that exceed normal parameters for her station, recommended increased supervision and limitation of social contact. The child shows similar tendencies. Early intervention advised." The relationship between Mary Johnson and Edmund Whitmore became a subject of speculation among the enslaved community, though such speculation was dangerous and rarely articulated openly. Susanna Davis, who worked in the main house as a seamstress, later told WPA researchers that Edmund would often request Mary's presence for household tasks that seemed unnecessary, polishing silver that was already clean, organizing books in the library, cleaning windows that needed no attention. These interactions, conducted under the pretext of domestic duties, lasted longer than similar tasks assigned to other workers. Edmund's own writings, discovered among family papers in 1959, suggest a complex relationship with the institution he had inherited. In a diary entry from July 1, 1847, he wrote, "Observed M today, reading the spines of books while dusting the library. When confronted, she claimed to be admiring the gold lettering, but her eyes moved too systematically, too purposefully. There is an intelligence there that both fascinates and disturbs me." The entry continues with philosophical musings about the nature of human capability and the moral contradictions of slavery that reveal a young man struggling with inherited beliefs. The summer heat of 1847 was particularly oppressive, according to weather records maintained by the Charleston Observatory. Temperatures exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit for 23 consecutive days in July, creating conditions that strained both human and animal endurance. The rice fields, dependent on carefully managed flooding systems, required constant attention to prevent crop failure. It was during this period of environmental stress that the first reports of strange sounds began to emerge from the slave quarters. Multiple witnesses described hearing what they characterized as scratching or scraping sounds emanating from Mary's cabin during the late evening hours. The sounds occurred regularly, always after the plantation had settled into sleep, and always ceased if anyone approached too closely. James Sullivan conducted several investigations but found nothing that explained the disturbances. His reports to Cornelius Whitmore, preserved in plantation correspondence, grew increasingly frustrated as the sounds continued without apparent source. The mystery deepened when Ruth, Mary's daughter, began displaying behaviors that concerned both the enslaved community and the plantation management. The child, who had previously been quiet and compliant, started speaking in what witnesses described as formal language, using complete sentences and vocabulary that seemed advanced for her age. More disturbing was her apparent knowledge of letters and numbers, skills that no enslaved child should have possessed. When questioned about how Ruth had acquired this knowledge, Mary insisted that the child was naturally precocious and had learned nothing from her. Evangeline Whitmore took particular interest in Ruth's development, often summoning the child to the main house for what she termed observations. These sessions, described in letters to her sister in Savannah, involved testing Ruth's responses to various stimuli, showing her illustrated books, having her identify objects by name, and assessing her ability to follow complex instructions. Evangeline's correspondence reveals a growing fascination with the child's capabilities and a determination to understand their source. The plantation's isolation became more pronounced as summer progressed. The Ashley River, which provided the estate's connection to Charleston, had fallen to unusually low levels due to drought conditions. Supply boats arrived less frequently, mail delivery became irregular, and the sense of being cut off from the outside world grew stronger. This isolation created an atmosphere where unusual behaviors and mysterious sounds took on greater significance, where every deviation from routine became a potential threat to the carefully maintained order. Religious services for the enslaved community were conducted every Sunday by visiting ministers or, more frequently, by Edmund Whitmore himself. These sessions took place in a cleared area between the slave quarters and were mandatory for all residents. Episcopal church records indicate that the summer services of 1847 were unusually well attended, and that participants displayed what clergy described as exceptional devotion. However, this apparent religiosity masked something more complex: coded communications, shared glances and subtle gestures that suggested an undercurrent of organization among the enslaved population. Mary Johnson's participation in these religious gatherings became increasingly prominent as July progressed into August. Witnesses described her as leading hymns with remarkable skill and offering prayers that, while appropriate in content, seemed to carry hidden meanings. The ability to read scripture, even if limited, would have given her unusual authority within the enslaved community, an authority that could have been extremely dangerous if discovered by plantation management. The first concrete evidence of Mary's literacy emerged in early August, when Cornelius Whitmore discovered marks carved into the wooden walls of her cabin. The marks, initially dismissed as decorative scratches, were revealed upon closer examination to be letters and words. A house slave named Peter, who possessed some reading ability acquired during childhood service in the main house, was forced to examine the markings and report their meaning. His testimony, recorded in plantation disciplinary records, described the carvings as words of prayer and remembrance, but provided no specific details about their content. The investigation into Mary's activities intensified following this discovery. Sullivan instituted nightly patrols of the slave quarters and implemented a system of rotating supervision that made private activity virtually impossible. The scratching sounds ceased, but this silence created its own form of tension. The absence of the familiar disturbance left everyone on edge, waiting for the next development in what had become an increasingly complex situation. Edmund Whitmore's journal entries from this period reveal a young man caught between duty and conscience. His August 10th entry describes a conversation with Mary that took place while she worked in the library. Asked her directly about the markings in her cabin, she maintained that they were decorative, claimed no knowledge of their meaning, but her eyes. There was defiance there, carefully controlled but unmistakable. I find myself both admiring her courage and fearing its implications. The entry suggests that Edmund was beginning to understand the full scope of what Mary had been doing, and the risks involved for everyone on the plantation. The Whitmore family's correspondence during August 1847 reveals growing tension within the household itself. Evangeline's letters to her sister become increasingly concerned with maintaining order and preventing what she termed corruption from spreading among the enslaved population. Cornelius's business letters mention the need for stricter discipline and enhanced security measures. The family was clearly responding to a perceived threat that went beyond a single woman's defiant behavior. Dr. Morrison's medical visits to the plantation increased during this period, though his official reports mention only routine care for minor ailments and injuries. His private journal, however, tells a different story. An entry dated August 15th describes Mary as exhibiting signs of nervous excitement despite apparent calm demeanor, and notes that Ruth continues to demonstrate cognitive development that exceeds normal parameters. Morrison's recommendations included separation of mother and child and implementation of what he termed corrective measures to address Mary's disruptive influence. And the enslaved community's response to the increasing scrutiny was one of careful solidarity. Oral histories suggest that a network of protection had formed around Mary and Ruth, with various individuals taking small risks to shield them from the worst consequences of discovery. This protection took the form of providing alibis for unexplained absences, sharing information about patrol schedules, and creating diversions when necessary. The network operated through the same subtle communication methods that had characterized religious gatherings: gestures, coded language, and shared understanding that required no explicit coordination. Kitchen records from the plantation show unusual patterns of food distribution during late August 1847. Extra portions were being prepared and distributed in ways that suggested some enslaved people were receiving additional rations while others went without. This redistribution occurred despite increased supervision and suggests a level of organization that plantation management failed to detect. The implications were clear. If Mary Johnson's activities had inspired this level of coordinated resistance, the threat to plantation stability was far greater than initially understood. The temperature began to moderate as August progressed toward September, but the atmosphere on the plantation remained tense. The rice harvest was approaching, a period that would require intense labor from the entire enslaved population and would make surveillance more difficult. Cornelius Whitmore made the decision to resolve the Mary Johnson situation before harvest activities complicated matters further. His plan, outlined in a letter to his brother in Columbia, involved what he termed permanent relocation of both Mary and Ruth to eliminate their disruptive influence. On September 3, 1847, Mary Johnson was summoned to the main house for what Sullivan described as final questioning regarding her activities and their extent. She left her cabin that morning carrying Ruth and was accompanied by 2 other enslaved women who served as witnesses to ensure proper procedures were followed. According to their testimony, recorded years later by WPA researchers, Mary showed no sign of fear or surprise at the summons. She had dressed Ruth in the child's best clothing and carried a small bundle that contained, they assumed, impersonal belongings. The questioning session, conducted in Cornelius Whitmore's study, lasted approximately 3 hours. No record exists of what was said during this time, but house slaves reported hearing raised voices and, at one point, the sound of furniture being overturned. Dr. Morrison arrived near the end of the session, presumably summoned to provide medical consultation regarding Mary's mental state or to administer sedatives if necessary. His presence added an ominous dimension to proceedings that were already fraught with danger for Mary and her daughter. When the study doors finally opened, only Cornelius Whitmore, Dr. Morrison, and James Sullivan emerged. Mary Johnson and Ruth were nowhere to be seen, and attempts by the witness women to inquire about their whereabouts were met with orders to return immediately to their quarters. The official explanation, provided the following morning, was that Mary and Ruth had been sold to a plantation in Georgia and had departed during the night to begin their journey. This explanation satisfied legal requirements for accounting for enslaved property, but raised immediate questions among those who knew the family. The story of the nighttime departure began to unravel within days of its announcement. Enslaved people who worked in the main house reported that no preparations had been made for travel, no food packed, no arrangements for transportation, no communication with potential buyers in Georgia. More significantly, Mary's personal belongings remained in her cabin, untouched and seemingly forgotten. The bundle she had carried to the main house was never accounted for, and its contents became a subject of speculation and fear. Sullivan's behavior in the days following September 3rd provided additional cause for concern. The overseer, typically aggressive and confrontational in his dealings with enslaved workers, became withdrawn and unusually quiet. He avoided the cabin that Mary and Ruth had occupied and seemed reluctant to discuss their departure with anyone, including Cornelius Whitmore. His night patrols, previously conducted with military precision, became erratic and sometimes skipped entirely. The rice harvest proceeded on schedule, despite the unsettling atmosphere that had settled over the plantation. Workers moved through the flooded fields with mechanical efficiency, but conversations were muted and the usual work songs were rarely heard. The silence was noted by visiting overseers from neighboring plantations, who commented on the unusual subdued mood among typically vocal enslaved workers. The harvest yields were adequate but not exceptional, a disappointment that Cornelius Whitmore attributed to the disruptions of the summer months. Dr. Morrison's visits to the plantation ceased entirely after September 3rd. Despite standing arrangements for regular medical care, his abrupt withdrawal from plantation affairs was explained as a response to increased demands at his Charleston practice, but the timing suggested other motivations. When contacted months later by concerned family members seeking information about Mary and Ruth's departure, Morrison claimed no memory of events beyond routine medical consultations and referred all inquiries to plantation management. The empty cabin became a source of ongoing disturbance for the enslaved community. Despite official orders to reassign the living space to other families, no one was willing to occupy quarters that had been associated with Mary Johnson's mysterious activities and sudden disappearance. Strange sounds continued to emanate from the structure during evening hours, not the scratching that had characterized Mary's residence, but different sounds that witnesses described as settling or sighing, as if the building itself was responding to abandonment. Edmund Whitmore's journal entries from September 1847 reveal a young man struggling with events he cannot fully comprehend or accept. His September 10th entry reads, "Visited M's former quarters today, found scratches on walls more extensive than previously reported. The markings cover entire sections of interior walls and include not just letters, but drawings, diagrams. What might be maps or plans? How long had this been going on? How much did we fail to see?" The entry suggests that Mary's activities had been far more extensive and organized than anyone had realized. Church records from St. Philip's Episcopal contain a curious entry dated September 15th, 1847. The notation, written in the margin of the parish register, states, "Baptismal certificate requested for Mary Johnson and child Ruth. Request denied due to irregular circumstances. No further action recommended." The request had been submitted by Edmund Whitmore, who provided no explanation for his interest in posthumous religious documentation for enslaved people who had allegedly been sold and relocated. The autumn months brought a gradual return to routine plantation operations, but underlying tensions remained. New enslaved families were required to replace Mary and Ruth and to provide additional labor for expanded rice cultivation. These newcomers were housed in different quarters, and the empty cabin was eventually converted to storage space for agricultural tools. The conversion effectively eliminated the physical evidence of Mary's residence and activities, but memories within the enslaved community proved more persistent. Oral traditions preserved Mary Johnson's story through the generations that followed 1847. These accounts, collected during WPA interviews in the 1930s, painted a picture of a woman who had used her literacy not just for personal expression, but as a tool for documenting the realities of enslaved life. According to these traditions, Mary had been creating a comprehensive record of plantation operations, including detailed accounts of punishment, working conditions, family separations, and the complex network of relationships that bound the enslaved community together. The physical evidence supporting these oral traditions emerged decades later during renovation work on the Charleston mansion. In 1955, construction workers discovered a sealed space beneath the main house that contained numerous documents, personal effects, and what appeared to be a detailed journal written in multiple hands. The collection was initially dismissed as household discards, but closer examination revealed sophisticated documentation of plantation life from the perspective of enslaved people, a viewpoint virtually unknown in official historical records. The journal, which consisted of more than 200 pages of text and drawings, provided unprecedented insight into the daily realities of enslaved existence. The writing demonstrated multiple authors, but showed consistency in organization and purpose that suggested careful coordination. Most entries were unsigned, but handwriting analysis conducted in 1961 identified at least 3 distinct writers, one of whom was almost certainly Mary Johnson, based on comparison with the cabin wall markings. The content of the journal was both revelatory and disturbing. Detailed accounts of forced family separations were accompanied by carefully drawn family trees that tracked kinship relationships across multiple plantations. Medical experiments conducted by Dr. Morrison were documented with clinical precision, including descriptions of procedures that violated every standard of medical ethics. Most shocking were the architectural drawings that showed hidden spaces throughout the main house and outbuildings, spaces that could be used for concealment or escape. The discovery raised immediate questions about how such extensive documentation could have been created and hidden without detection. The answer appeared to lie in the complex network of enslaved workers who had access to different areas of the plantation and who had coordinated their efforts to gather and preserve information. The journal represented not the work of an individual, but the collective effort of an entire community to document their experience for future generations. Edmund Whitmore's involvement in this documentation effort became clear through entries in the journal that referenced conversations and information that only he could have provided. His growing moral conflict with slavery had apparently led him to share details about plantation operations, family business affairs, and even architectural plans that enabled the enslaved community to create their comprehensive record. This collaboration was extraordinarily dangerous for everyone involved and explained the extreme measures taken to suppress Mary Johnson's activities. The revelation that Mary Johnson had been the coordinator rather than just a participant in these documentation efforts cast her disappearance in a new light. The threat she posed was not simply individual defiance, but the potential exposure of an entire network of resistance that included free white collaborators. The stakes were high enough to justify extreme measures to ensure silence, and the lack of any subsequent investigation into her whereabouts suggested that powerful interests were invested in maintaining secrecy. Dr. Morrison's role in Mary's disappearance became clearer through medical records discovered during the demolition of his Charleston practice in 1963. Among his papers were detailed notes on what he termed behavioral modification procedures that he had developed specifically for use on enslaved populations. These procedures, described in clinical language that masked their brutal reality, were designed to eliminate what Morrison characterized as excessive intellectual curiosity and disruptive social behaviors among enslaved people. The medical records indicated that Morrison had conducted these experimental procedures on numerous subjects over a period of several years, using various Charleston plantations as testing grounds. The Whitmore estate was frequently mentioned as a site for what he termed advanced interventions, designed to address cases that conventional discipline could not resolve. Mary Johnson was specifically referenced in notes dated August and September 1847, with Morrison documenting her case as an example of successful treatment. The nature of Morrison's treatment was implied rather than explicitly described in his notes, but the implications were clear. References to permanent behavioral modification and complete elimination of disruptive tendencies suggested procedures that went far beyond conventional medical intervention. The absence of any subsequent records for Mary or Ruth Johnson supported the conclusion that Morrison's treatment had achieved its intended goal of complete silence. The broader implications of Morrison's activities extended beyond individual cases to reveal a systematic program of psychological and physical control that relied on medical authority to justify extreme measures. His correspondence with colleagues in Charleston and throughout the South showed that similar programs were being implemented on plantations across the region, creating a network of medical professionals dedicated to developing more effective methods of maintaining enslaved compliance. The financial records associated with Morrison's services provided additional evidence of the scope of his activities. Payments from the Whitmore estate and other plantations were categorized as medical expenses, but the amounts were significantly higher than those typically associated with routine healthcare. The elevated fees suggested services that went beyond conventional treatment and were consistent with payments for specialized procedures that required particular expertise and discretion. The cover-up that followed Mary Johnson's disappearance involved multiple layers of deception, designed to prevent any investigation into her fate. Church records were altered to remove references to her baptismal status. Plantation documents were revised to show her sale to Georgia buyers, and shipping records were falsified to create evidence of her departure from Charleston. The coordination required for such comprehensive deception indicated the involvement of powerful interests with the resources and authority to manipulate official documentation. James Sullivan's sudden departure from the Whitmore plantation in November 1847 marked the final stage of the cover-up effort. His resignation, attributed to family obligations in Ireland, removed the last witness who could have provided first-hand testimony about the events of September 3rd. Sullivan's departure was facilitated by generous severance payments and assistance with transportation costs that suggested the resignation was more termination than voluntary decision. The replacement overseer, brought from a plantation in Virginia, was specifically chosen for his lack of familiarity with local enslaved communities and his reputation for maintaining order through intimidation rather than engagement. His appointment effectively ended any possibility that questions about Mary Johnson's disappearance would be raised within the plantation hierarchy, and his management style discouraged the kind of community organization that had made the documentation effort possible. The enslaved community's response to these changes was one of enforced silence that masked continued resistance. The documentation efforts continued in modified form, with greater attention to security and more limited scope to reduce detection risks. The network that had formed around Mary Johnson's activities remained intact, but operated with increased caution and more sophisticated methods of communication and coordination. The physical evidence of Mary's fate was never discovered, despite efforts by family members and community activists in later years to locate burial sites or other traces of her disappearance. The river systems around Charleston provided numerous locations where evidence could be permanently concealed, and the passage of time made any investigation increasingly difficult. The lack of physical evidence allowed the official story of her sale and relocation to remain unchallenged in public records. The psychological impact of Mary Johnson's disappearance extended far beyond the immediate plantation community. News of her fate, transmitted through networks of enslaved workers who moved between plantations, served as a warning about the consequences of resistance and the lengths to which plantation owners would go to maintain control. The message was clear: literacy, organization, and documentation were crimes punishable by death, and no level of caution could guarantee safety. The long-term consequences of the Mary Johnson case influenced plantation management practices throughout the Charleston region. Increased surveillance of enslaved quarters became standard procedure. Restrictions on gatherings were enforced more strictly, and any evidence of literacy or intellectual development among enslaved people was met with immediate intervention. The case established precedents for dealing with what plantation owners termed exceptional intelligence among enslaved populations. The documentation that Mary and her collaborators had created served its intended purpose, despite the tragic cost of its creation. The journal and related materials provided future generations with an authentic record of enslaved experience that contradicted official histories and revealed the complex realities of plantation life. The courage required to create and preserve these documents in the face of deadly consequences demonstrated the determination of enslaved people to ensure their stories would survive. Educational institutions that acquired the discovered documents recognized their historical significance, but struggled with questions about how to present materials that documented such systematic brutality. The University of South Carolina's Archive Department, which received the largest collection of materials in 1964, initially restricted access to qualified researchers and required special permission for examination of the most disturbing documents. The broader historical context of Mary Johnson's story reflected the tensions inherent in a society built on enslaved labor, but increasingly influenced by humanitarian ideals. The contradiction between Christian values and enslaved ownership created moral conflicts that some individuals, like Edmund Whitmore, found impossible to resolve through conventional means. Their attempts to address these conflicts often led to dangerous collaborations that threatened the entire system. The medical profession's involvement in maintaining enslaved compliance represented one of the most disturbing aspects of the institutional support for slavery. Dr. Morrison's activities demonstrated how scientific authority could be used to justify extreme measures and provide legitimacy for practices that would otherwise be recognized as torture. The medical establishment's silence about these practices revealed the extent to which professional ethics were subordinated to economic and social interests. The legal system's failure to investigate Mary Johnson's disappearance illustrated the limitations of justice in a society where enslaved people had no legal standing and where powerful interests could manipulate official processes to prevent unwanted scrutiny. The absence of any official inquiry into her fate demonstrated that legal protections extended only to those with sufficient social and economic power to demand enforcement. The religious community's response to the case was similarly compromised by economic and social pressures. Church leaders who might have been expected to condemn the treatment of Mary Johnson instead chose silence to avoid confrontation with influential parishioners whose financial support was essential for church operations. The failure of religious institutions to provide moral leadership in such cases undermined their credibility as advocates for justice and human dignity. The economic calculations that drove decisions about Mary Johnson's fate reflected the brutal arithmetic of enslaved labor. The cost of maintaining a potentially disruptive worker was weighed against the value of the labor she provided and the risk she posed to overall plantation productivity. When the balance tipped toward elimination rather than management, the decision was implemented with the same cold efficiency used for any other business transaction. The technological limitations of the 1840s meant that evidence of crimes could be eliminated more easily than in later periods. The absence of photography, fingerprinting, or systematic record-keeping made it possible to erase virtually all traces of individuals and events when powerful interests were committed to such erasure. Mary Johnson's disappearance benefited from these limitations and the general indifference of law enforcement to crimes against enslaved people. The psychological trauma experienced by enslaved communities in the aftermath of Mary Johnson's disappearance created lasting effects that influenced behavior for generations. The fear instilled by her fate served as an effective deterrent to resistance activities, but it also fostered resentment and determination that would eventually contribute to more organized opposition to slavery. The memory of her courage inspired future generations of activists who recognized the importance of documentation and testimony in fighting injustice. The preservation of Mary Johnson's story through oral tradition demonstrated the resilience of enslaved communities and their commitment to maintaining their own historical narrative, despite official attempts to control information. The accuracy of these oral accounts, confirmed by later document discoveries, showed that enslaved people possessed sophisticated methods for preserving and transmitting important information across generations. The discovery of hidden documents decades after Mary's disappearance revealed the inadequacy of official historical records in capturing the full reality of enslaved experience. Traditional sources created by and for white plantation owners presented a sanitized version of slavery that obscured its most brutal aspects. The documents created by enslaved people themselves provided a corrective to these distorted accounts and demonstrated the importance of seeking multiple perspectives on historical events. The collaboration between enslaved people and sympathetic whites in creating documentation represented one of the earliest forms of what would later be recognized as civil rights activism. The risks taken by individuals like Edmund Whitmore to support these efforts demonstrated that moral opposition to slavery existed even among those who benefited from the system. Their willingness to act on their convictions, despite the dangers involved, provided hope for eventual change. The systematic nature of the cover-up following Mary Johnson's disappearance showed how effectively powerful interests could coordinate to suppress inconvenient truths. The involvement of medical, legal, religious, and business authorities in maintaining silence about her fate demonstrated the extent to which slavery depended on institutional cooperation to function effectively. This coordination made resistance more difficult, but also revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by organized opposition. The long-term impact of Mary Johnson's story extended beyond its immediate historical context to influence later discussions about slavery, resistance, and memory. Her case became a symbol of the countless enslaved people whose stories were erased from official records but preserved through alternative means. The eventual discovery of her documentation efforts validated the importance of seeking hidden histories and challenging dominant narratives about the past. Today, more than 170 years after Mary Johnson's disappearance, her story continues to resonate as a reminder of both the brutality of slavery and the courage of those who resisted it. The documents she helped create provide invaluable insight into the lived experience of enslaved people and demonstrate the sophistication of their efforts to document their own history. Her legacy serves as testimony to the power of literacy, organization, and collective memory in the struggle for justice and human dignity. The empty spaces in official records where Mary Johnson's name should appear serve as monuments to all those whose stories were deliberately erased from history. Their absence speaks as loudly as any documented testimony about the systematic effort to control not just the bodies of enslaved people, but their voices and memories as well. The recovery of even fragmentary evidence of their lives and experiences represents a victory over those who sought to ensure their permanent silence. The questions that remain about Mary Johnson's final days may never be answered, but the impact of her life and work can be measured in the documents she left behind and the courage she inspired in others. Her story reminds us that resistance took many forms, that literacy was a weapon against oppression, and that the determination to bear witness to injustice could survive even the most determined efforts to suppress it. The sound of scratching that once emanated from her cabin, the sound of someone determined to document truth despite mortal danger, continues to echo through time as a reminder that some voices refuse to be silenced, no matter the cost. In the preservation of her story, Mary Johnson achieved a form of immortality that her oppressors could never destroy, ensuring that her witness to the realities of enslaved life would eventually find its audience, and her courage would inspire future generations in their own struggles for justice.